Hi, this is Nathan Orloff, editor of John Wick Chapter 4, and this is my timeline tour. So this is the master timeline, as some people call it. I've never seen it before. I don't work this way. So this is just every single clip in the movie, strung out together, back to back. It's too unwieldy. It's too much to work with, so we break everything down in reels. Based loosely around 35mm film print lengths, Lionsgate still archives this way, where they print the movie to film and put it in a cave. So we have to adhere to these reel lengths, and that's why we'll have a weird reel 10, which I will get to. So if we, at the opening of the movie here, we begin with these punches. And Chad really wanted to scare the shit out of everybody. So we had black, we had nothing. We had no ambience, music died down, and then out of it were these punches. And there was these rhythmic punches, in coordination with the cantos with Lawrence Fishburne. And so what it did is they created these punches actually in another timeline, and then I created an audio mixdown and created a basically LCR and sub of an audio mixdown so that we had the same sound of the punches. And we can accent the last one, you might notice, has one more little thing. The design of the punches between the whoosh of the hand coming in and the board and the knuckles cracking, we had so much stuff, it was too much for one timeline. I don't like too many audio tracks. I like being able to see everything all at once. I don't like editing and scrolling around. One of the reasons that I don't label my video tracks is that video tracks, I find, more than sound, if you start labeling video tracks, you're adhering to something for no reason. V6 is where we have our VFX titles. So anytime there's a visual effect, that is a subcap saying what that visual effect is. And the reason I'm just talking about in terms of how many layers is frustrating is that I do a lot of what I call split comps or split frames, or I change the performances. I can control and slow down one side of the frame and let the other side of the performance breathe so that the timing of someone on a close-up on over the shoulder is the exact timing that I want it to be, whether it's a look down or a step into frame. I kind of learned how to do that on films with child actors a lot so that I could sort of control the exact timing of things, especially on these, it was a lower budget film. They had to run and gun, and you had to find sort of the best takes. And sometimes I would change takes if the setup was close enough and have visual effects stitch what was in between. So I do a lot of split comps. But at the same time, if I do a lot of split comps, sometimes I have 2, 3, maybe even 4 layers. But I don't want to have to force everyone on every single track to always have 4 empty layers just because sometimes I use 4 layers. That's why it's a little bit more of Tetris on the top and not necessarily as religiously organized. We usually have the dailies at the bottom. I'm very strict about usually only having stuff on V1. I don't usually ever leave choices or alts. Usually I have that in sub bins or sub timelines. That's where I have my alt stuff. I do not leave alternate choices. I leave everything on V1 unless it's a split comp, and then it's stacked. Then we'll have our yellow, light yellow temp comp, and then our green visual effect, and the green that you see is our final color. This is the final timeline, so you're not really seeing any of there was a different color for green for when it was a temp effect. You can also see the markers on the dailies. Those are also marking the visual effect shots, and that would leave notes for visual effects and for sound, being like, this isn't what's needed here, this is what's needed here, as I would finish something and send it off to the rest of the team. So if you look at the bottom here, there's kind of different colors of yellow. We color coordinated what was stuff that was from our sound libraries and what was stuff from the sound libraries of Formosa and Mark Schrodinger and the sound team that gave it to us. So the brighter something is, the better it is. Either more official or the bright green is the final. The bright yellow is the desert sound effect that we can go for final. If it's more muted and less saturated, it usually means it's temp and kind of gross. The one complicated thing is if we go to this music down below. The interesting thing about working on John Wick Chapter 4 is I had 3 movies of score to work from. And not just 3 movies of score, I had 3 movies of stems. I created this temp mix as I assembled the movie. And that's why I have 4 audio tracks here, is that I created this temp mix based off stems from other John Wick films that sounded John Wick, that was John Wick, that was the score of John Wick, but also in ways we've never heard them. There were stems that I was pulling from stuff that Chad was like, what is that? And it's like this random sound from a stem you would never have heard of from this taxi cab moment in John Wick Chapter 3. I pulled it out and created it to be this samurai sword fight intro. And so music was a huge thing for what I did on Chapter 4, and I'm using these 4 tracks below. We had some sort of stock footage stuff here or aerials that was red. This is where it starts to become obvious where I'm using some audio effects. And during production, there was a scene in the boat, which is in Reel 7, which I'll get to, which had this really loud motor engine sound. But it's a really great performance, and I kind of found it impossible to cut the scene. So I finally just bit the bullet. I didn't really wait for the studio. I just paid for it myself. I bought the Isotope Dialogue Isolate plugin, and it was magic. And then we ended up starting using it on the entire film and then asked Lionsgate to install it on everyone's computers. Just worked like magic, removing background noise from things. But the interesting thing it also does is it takes out reverb. And if you watch the movie, there are tons and tons and tons of big, big spaces. And reverb, we found, was this essential tool to sell the mythic story that we're trying to tell about David and Goliath or Hercules and the Hydra, as, you know, in terms of, you know, Winston walks into the office in New York of the Marquis. He is entering like a Greek myth. And so we added these reverb tracks. We have dialogue, dialogue, and dialogue reverb. And then I would use the default Avid Audio deverb. And what was interesting is that we sort of, it's never the same on every single reel. We sort of did this approximation of what would be the best reverb for that reel's scenes in terms of what dialogue needed it. And if we go back all the way to the right on that scene, we have both things stacked. We have the thing on the reverb and a thing not on the reverb. So that means we were able to do our own custom wet-dry mix per line. That's why they're stacked right next to each other on A2 and A3. So that, you know, there's a line where the Marquis might yell and it might need more reverb and we boost it. And so it was this delicate balance that Nicholas, the first additional editor, and he basically just did our entire temp sound mix completely by himself, did a masterful job doing this mix. And it was all controlled within here. Anytime I leave a dialogue muted in the timeline, what that means is I've replaced the take performance-wise, but I've left the original there muted so that the sound team later on can have the right waveforms to match the lip sync. Usually I'll do my best to make the lip syncs match. Usually it'll play, no one will notice, but I always leave it there because the audio people will definitely notice. So we have PFX on A4. PFX were mainly useful in assembly phase and production. PFX also has another RTAS effect that has a huge, huge, huge limiter. They never shot blanks on set, but there were plugged guns that had something that exploded out the side, not the front, just so that they had the trigger pull and there was a big loud bang. It's more like a loud click. It doesn't sound like a gun. It was like a loud click, but it was useful for us at least until we could replace gunshots, which was a lot of work, which I'll get to. So we had PFX in the timeline that also had a hard limiter so we didn't blow out our speakers. But going back to RTAS, on all the dialogues, including reverb, we would have an equalizer, a light equalizer. And this is something that Will Files had us set up a long time ago when I worked at Bad Robot. We had these RTAS effects that were like these magical plugins that are just did a little dialogue sweetening on everything. EQ, compressor, and a de-esser in that order. And we threw it on every single dialogue track. And then the reverb came after that. Moving on to effects, here's our effects stuff. And we also had some very light limiters on here. This was the show we learned to use limiters on every single track because of how loud everything was in terms of just sort of protecting ourselves and protecting when we went to a preview, because we actually never did a full Pro Tools temp mix. We did a preview out of our Avid temp mix. It sounded that good. And then you can notice on A10, we have a effects reverb track, and that's for gunshots and things like that we want to add reverb to. And then we have our stereo effects, which usually ended up, sometimes the stereo effects blended into stereo backgrounds and ambience, depending on what the scene needed. But stereo effects became more like cars and things like that, because gunshots are typically pretty mono. It was shocking how much this movie just was like center channel, center channel, center channel, because it's dialogue and gunshots are typically mono center channel unless there's something very specific. Unless it's like the stair sequence when there's gunshots all over, then we were panning like hell. I mean, still it's a mono effect that you're panning and controlling. So then we have 2 tracks of BG. And like I said, sometimes these go a little bit between this and stereo effects, depending on the scene. The music we might have had no limiters on and more of a general EQ to bring some of it into the sub. Let's go to Reel 2. So Reel 2 is when we go to Osaka. And Osaka is kind of a fun musical journey where we start off with our own score that turns into this Osaka theme. It turns into kind of the background music of the lobby. And then we go upstairs to this R.I.P. Slime track. This is a Japanese rap band that Nicholas Lundgren, the guy who I've mentioned, is a fan of. This is a good example of, while, of course, everything's been changed for the final mix and the composers have done their score on top of it, Chad and I sort of found the right tone and the right vibes using the temp score that I was mentioning, using all the stems of the original movies, the original 3. Of course, the composers come along and do a polished version that's tailored to our film. Here's an example of something we hadn't replaced yet. So you can see that this is from the Elder Tent of the last movie of John Wick Chapter 3. And that was me using these stems to create a new thing. And this Elder Tent cue has maybe 8 to 12 different stems, and I picked out these 3. So it gave the vibe of the original, but it was also totally new. And it was really, really fun to have that depth of music to play with. It was wonderful. Tip music is sometimes the hardest things to cut with, and I felt like I had a treasure trove. And so here also, it's kind of funny to see how much of a little bit of an info dump the beginning of Reel 2 is in terms of just like it's dialogue. We're learning about people. Okay. And this is where the action starts. So this is where Ali Andrus II, her masterful sound editing really starts shining through. She basically became our temp sound editor, as Nicholas was the temp sound mixer. And so she cut all of this sound to gunshots and impacts and whatnot. And what we learned very, very early on is that we needed to lead with sound in terms of gunshots. Because when visual effects did it, it was fine, but then we'd have to figure out, and we would kind of work backwards in terms of, oh, wait a minute, but what about this? And there's this rhythm that we'd want to create the scenes. And sometimes we'd want to like fib where the gunshot is based on just rhythm. So Ali Andrus was the queen of impacts and gunshots. And so we discovered that we wanted this to come from editorial and wanted to come from a story perspective. So she would lay in using a title tool on another track that's now gone, video track, a little red dot or different colored dots. Actually, she color coded which gunshots were from whom and would then layer them. And we discovered quickly that gunshots and impacts were always basically one frame apart. Unless someone got shot point blank, you wanted gunshot, then impact. It had to be one frame apart. So she would show red gunshot, red impact over here in the next frame. And she layered this throughout the entire film, every single gunshot, and matched it with sound. And then went through me and Chad for approval. And then we shipped it off for VFX and saying, this is the approved timing and layout of gunshots and impacts, because it was so much to manage. So it had to be this sort of assembly line of Chad had to approve it before visual effects got it. Otherwise, you're wasting a lot of visual effects time reviewing and altering and reviewing and altering. We really did it just by this avid little red dot. Then that's how she built all of these impacts and gunshots here below, which are a tremendous amount of work and took a long, long time. And she did a great job. She did a stellar job. There are times you can see it here, there's an 821, 5-1. This is later in the process where Formosa and Mark Schrodinger's gave us like a 5-1 little mix of certain sections that were incredibly complicated. Our first preview didn't have this. I believe our second preview did. So they did have a little work for this. It was the lobby fight. If you look over here to the right, it's this orange clip. So this, you notice that she has a lot of effects muted or gone, and we have this like 5-1 just blast of something that the sound team created and gave for us, so which was really nice. So this is hilarious. Look at this on the left here. So this is the beginning of Exhibition Hall in Reel 3. And Exhibition Hall is the perfect one I was talking about, where they're using plugged guns, so there's nothing that's possible to come out. There's no blanks, but there's a tiny bit of gunpowder and a little fire that comes out the side. So there is this click, this loud click. And so we were using that as this PFX layer. So that is sort of like when people were shooting. And we layered gunshots on top of it because there was a lot of this yelling. It's a very enclosed space. We wanted the voices and the vocalizations of the talent in there. It was something that we couldn't just wholesale replace, especially as a temp. So that's why that there's all this PFX stuff here and then layered gunshots and impacts. And I should say, like, the extent that there's no visual, this is the exhibition hall sequence where it's in the museum and Keanu has these nunchucks and he keeps hitting these waves of guys. And at the end here, you notice then when Kane comes, it switches. So my favorite choices in the movie is you notice Exhibition Hall has this long music track. It goes all the way. And then when Kane shows up, there's no music. And this was a intentional choice by me early on that I'm kind of shocked it stayed all the way, is that when Kane fights, there's no music. I want us to feel like, how is he doing this? How is he hearing this? And not only that, this came about just by kind of organic feeling, is after like this 9-minute fight of nunchucks and guns. And it's like, da 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 da. It's like classic John Wick. It just makes you like, oh my God, we're here. Keanu's kicking ass. And he's just person after person. And then Kane shows up. It felt, there was no music that could level up the threat. There was no music that could make us more scared. It was no music that made me terrified for John. It was no music that made me had no idea what was going to happen next. The kitchen fight with Kane is like using the doorbell things in Reel 2 to like know where people are and you're supposed to have fun. That's a little different. This, I wanted people to be scared for what's going to happen. So there's no music here. Not until Tracker comes up and fires and saves John. And so I repeat that choice at the end of this reel with Shumazu in the forest sword fight, so that there's this intro music that intros these two people. It kind of sets up like this is a boss fight almost. But once they start sliding into their shoes and they're getting ready to fight, all you hear is water and crickets. I wanted people in the mindset of what Kane is actually hearing. I'm trying to bring as much realism to a blind swordsman as I possibly can. Here you can see the level of detail we went into. These orange things are actual stuff from sound team that gave us, as addition to these bright yellow actual Japanese insects. So again, these are stuff like, okay, this is good enough for final. This is there. And now you can see here below, there's a sort of lighter pink that I was talking about earlier with the color schemes. I used about, I would honestly say 95 to 98% was of the temp score was just stems of the original films. But there are cases like this where we use different score, and that was this color. And then I would mix temp score from other films, or this flute is just a flute from a Japanese video game, and I mix it with John Wick score. And then the composers did their kind of own spin on it, which sounds phenomenal. Same thing here. You can notice the break in music, and then we're back in, and there's the train station here, and then this is the destroyed Continental. And then reel 4 is kind of more of another setup reel. There's not a ton of action. It's very much about getting all the people in places and what they want and making their circumstances more dire. So John Wick goes to Berlin. Here we had some fun horse effects that we did in panning in round 5-1, since the horses are like circling the Marquis and the Harbinger characters. That was a lot of fun. And then there's another instance of fun music where we had music that this is actually classical music that's cut for this scene that we got, and then we fade in John Wick score and actually fade it back out and then fade it back in. I'm weird about doing weird shit with music in terms of like blending source, making it non-diegetic, bringing in score, going back out of it. I'd probably drive some people crazy. Oh, and this gray stuff, by the way, that's when the assistants create room tone out of production dialogue to fill air in spots, and that's what it is labeled. They put it gray. It's just very background. It's just to make things like when we use dialogue isolate, when it takes out all that reverb and background noise mainly, we can control it and put a little bit back in. One of my favorite cues in the movie is Gustaffelstein. We actually use it twice. Gustaffelstein's great artist, actually French, and we use it during the Arc de Triomphe sequence, but we also found this track here. And I thought this, when we found this track, to me, it just plays like score. And that's that line that I sometimes like to blur is whether or not it's a needle drop, because John Wick is just not really known for actually doing a true needle drop. And so in order to actually do it, we actually literally have a literal needle dropping in the movie. But this sort of feels like we bought it by score. This is when John says, "What do you get out of this, Winston?" And Winston says the same thing, "You're so good at getting revenge." And then we drop this, and it feels very like we're going to another world. We're going to Berlin. And the stuff that they shot for this Berlin montage was actually the first stuff they shot in the entire movie. And so it's actually a very weirdly nostalgic montage for me, because it was like the first time I went international to shoot this movie, and it's such a fun little track and a fun little intro to get us across the world. All right, reel 5. Reel 5 was a weird beast. First off, we start with one of my favorite dialogue scenes between Katya and John Wick. And he's hanging, okay? He's hanging. Going through the dailies on this scene was so much fun, because I just was pulling every time John was like, I just wanted to sell that he could barely breathe. And so it was this fun tension and release part of the editing process. and sound-wise, where Katya is taking her sweet time deciding whether or not she's going to ask John to come back and kill the guy at the club that killed her father. And he's just like off screen going, ugh. And so we had this really fun little dialogue stuff to do. And the cool thing about John Wick is they shot like, I think, 1 stage shoot. Maybe it was 2. Everything's on location. They shot this scene in an abandoned hospital. So the sound in there was kind of crazy. And so we did a little dialogue isolate, a little reverb. And this was also our most subtitles. And the subtitles were really fun to work on with Avid since I exclusively use subcap for subtitles, which might be kind of strange, but it just sort of allows me to change it all the time. And if I want to change the font size universally for a scene or a reel, I can do it really quickly and propagate all those changes. So I use subcap for a lot of it. And then we replaced it with more polished ones, and then eventually replaced it with made with After Effects. You can see these subtitles below the VFX here. But then eventually replaced it with stuff from Filmograph. Great, great guys. But yeah, I used subcap to do those subtitles and even did horizontal blurred transitions for each of them. Then we get to one of the hardest scenes I think I've ever cut is the poker scene. Again, like I said, I tailor each reel to what I need in terms of what audio tracks, what it is. I always maxed out at 20. I have my timeline view. I have my monitor. I want to be able to see everything. But we sort of squeeze to fit whatever we want. So what happened is that this club scene, I dealt with it because of dialogue isolate in terms of where a lot of times I would throw a whole scene, like a selects of a scene. I go through performances and I'll throw my dialogue isolate, render everything, grab a Diet Coke, come back, and then I can chop up that scene and have all the audio rendered. But I prefer not to render audio effects. So what I've done here is that we have this club sequence and there's multiple layers of music and effects on the RTAS. So I have music score here at the bottom, and then I have 18 music, which is sort of turns into as if I'm playing the club music as score, which it does a lot, but not all the time. So it's just playing it as its score, kind of, not necessarily totally realistic. Then I have interior on A17. Interior would be some of the basses kept out, some of the treble. It's a little bit more mid and highs are raised. And there's a little bit of reverb, trying to make it sound like you're actually inside a club and you are hearing it as if you're standing there. And we do this a bunch to mix it also, so that sometimes we're blending in the score version of it, sometimes we're doing the non-score version of it. Lastly, and this is my favorite, is A16 exterior. And the exterior is something I've also learned on other films. I did it a lot on Plan B, especially during a party scene where she was really drunk and you're just like in her head and it's really muffled and it's really background, but you still hear detail. And it's a EQ and a verb and a compressor and all this sort of stuff to sort of maintain detail and a little bit of clarity, but it's not in your face. You have this long poker scene that's supposed to be very intense. And we even have little score flourishes going throughout the whole thing, but it needed to be present. And I use that during the background of the poker scene. You can see this. We cut into the poker scene non-diegetic. We come in big to the wide shot, techno, house music, Powder, which is great DJ, one of the best DJs in the world. And then we transition to it being the exterior track, where it's very muffled. They're upstairs, they're above the club, but you can still hear it. And below, you can see this long track of music. That's the flourishes I'm talking about. And then above that were all these muted ones from my temp. And then the composers did their own. So I was pulling all these temp little, just like, whoa, like this like sort of accents, little piano, this and that just sort of accent the drama on top of this thump, thump, thump. But again, it couldn't just be thump, thump, thump. It had to actually have detail. Part of me wanted it to be like, I wanted the music to sound so good outside this room. You just wanted to get out and dance. Like you just wanted to get there. You knew it was coming. I just wanted people to know it was coming. It couldn't just be like a thump track. So over here, we then transition to La Castlevania, which is the DJ name of Dylan, one of the semi-composer contributors of the movie, amazing artist. And he did all of the house music, all the techno music. For a while, we had Answer Code Request as our temp, one of my also favorite DJs in the whole world. But then Dylan came up with an amazing track that fit everything really, really, really well. And you can see here the volume automation of how we transition in and out of the different mixes between exterior, interior, and non-diegetic. And it was imperative, like, so when John is standing up and it's all in his head and he's just like just falling off the cliff, basically, that it's basically back to that thump, thump, thump. And then we're slowly, as we're getting up, we're transitioning these waterfall, and we even, this is my favorite track is a bizarre waterfall right here. is that we're transitioning like the sound of the world back up, and then we go back into slow-mo for a second as he's like realizing what the hell's going on. And then quickly the light whirls around us, and then we whip from exterior keyframed volume automation to interior and a tiny bit of non-diegetic as we're like back into the real world, or we're back into the real world. And it's this fun thing that we got to play with as I was using my Avid Artist Mix to like keyframe all this stuff and sort of control where we are. And slow-mo is also a thing that I'm trying to remember. I don't believe is too much in John Wick. So there would be times where he throws an axe and I throw the music from interior to exterior a little bit. And I'm throwing it to more of this bassy in your head thing as it's doing this like slow-mo transition. And it just helps you buy this like, I just didn't want this to feel like same. I wanted to create this dynamic, both with music and with the visual and slow motion of like what's going on and the disorientation of everything. You can see on our timeline here above the site is anything that's pink is slow-mo. And lots of this is slow-mo that we just sped up so that it's normal frame. In order to cut it for DI, you have to have it as the slow-mo original clip. So they have a lot of speed effects on them. All that pink is slow motion, 48 frames per second. Reel 5 was such a crazy beast. Crazy. Reel 6, we're back to a dialogue reel, as you can see. Much more simple. A lot of RTAS reverb and dialogue isolate being used in these scenes. This is the scene in the Louvre, this big long one here. And that's with Winston and the Marquis talking about the rules of the duel and whatnot. They talk about doing the duel, and then this next scene is the rules of the duel. What's funny is that all of these scenes are VFX. What's actually interesting to me is that we actually did shoot in front of the Eiffel Tower, but there was construction that we had to paint out in certain areas of the background on the left and right of it. And then when the first teaser came out, the tip of the Eiffel Tower was not there, which was accurate. But everyone was like, what the hell? This looks weird. So we added the tip because the clouds were covering it. We thought it was cool. But it does look a little bit better with the tip of the Eiffel Tower there. But the Eiffel Tower is real. Reel 7, now we're heading towards the third act. So this is a fun bit where basically we're heading towards this sort of like montage area where we introduce the Suicide Girls, we introduce the DJ, and she does the, like I said, literal needle drop, which is Nowhere to Run. And so that's the montage of all the gangs getting ready. Nowhere to Run is this direct homage. The DJ is a direct homage to the wonderful movie The Warriors, where there's a DJ sort of on the radio telling everybody what to do, and she plays Nowhere to Run. This is our cover of it. Once we get to here, to me, I felt like we were having an excuse to sort of get more places in terms of how to be more liberal with music, which is fun. And then here's the famous boat scene I was talking about. This is where I bought Dialogue Isolate for. It was absolutely essential. It was just this horrendous boat motor right behind Winston. And we prefer not to use ADR as much as we can. That's a Chad thing and both of me thing, but sometimes you have to. And then below here, you can see this is an example. This is the example of early on. This is for our first preview. We did have a version that helped the arc sequence sound-wise. The arc sequence, Ali did a tremendous job. Nicholas did a tremendous job, as you can see how much work it is. But still, there's certain things that only the sound department can really do. And this is still their temp work. The final is even more incredible. So they gave us a 5-1 bed for the cars and backgrounds and traffic. And then we had our guns on top because it was nice. We said, we'll worry about the guns because that's going to change a lot. It's really, if you guys get the background cars and the world and the traffic and the horns, that stuff just clutters up a timeline so much. So that it was easy to sort of get that out of the way and done. And then here's the two sections of both. This is the Berlin street fight. Sorry, it's not Berlin street fight. We shot in Berlin. It's Paris street fight. And then the Arc de Triomphe. And then the Gustafsson on foot Arc de Triomphe sequence. This is the other Gustafsson track I was talking about. And he actually did a remix of this song for our movie. It was so cool. And so again, we have this blend of backgrounds that sound department gave us, needle drop track, and then all this work that Ali and Nicholas did up top, as well as these PFX that included some of the efforts and people flying. Because that's the thing is that the hits are real. The hits are real, and so are, and Keanu and the falling, and everything is real. The background got replaced. They had these cars on these sleds that would hit guys, and then we would just replace the car. Very tricky, but it turned out that was much easier, both reflection-wise and environment-wise, safety-wise. And that was the interesting thing to me is like, at no point is there like a CG body double. It's like they're all real guys getting really hit. Here's our darker green non-final VFX. That's what that looked like. So we would have dailies, temp VFX, and then non-final, and then final. Let's go to Reel 8. So Reel 8 is a fun one. The apartment complex was very complicated and actually got trimmed down quite a bit because the thing we wanted to get to the most was the top shot. And that's this big, long clip. And obviously, I think this screenshot was taken before we finalized the shot. The top shot, as you can see, really is just one shot. There is just one stitch here and then one there. And it sort of is just this magical blend of what they could do on set. And we used the walls as sort of lines to sort of go between one shot to another. And it was a beast sound-wise, just in terms of how much sound is needed to support it. And the Dragon's Breath by itself was its own beast. And hearing all the different kinds of guns that were coming after John and from all different people, because it's a big, wide shot where you just see everything. So when they're shooting through the walls, you need to hear the walls. You need to hit the plants, and you need to hit, like, where are all these bullets going? This one was a beast, and it was in the process for a very, very long time. I think it was the first thing we turned over, VFX-wise. And then let's see here. We got to jumps out the window, and stairs is the last time we see DJ, and it's the last excuse for me to throw in a needle drop for Justice. Genesis. It's such a great track. And they also did a remix for us for this movie. And I think because they were working on a new re-released album of it, but it was very cool that they worked on it and it tweaked it a little bit to fit our movie better. So that was very special. And then it's another French artist. So when we're in Paris, we're listening to French artists. And then when Donnie shows up is the only time that we use like true score with Donnie since The Kitchen, since it's more of a heroic moment between Donnie and John now working together. Spoiler alert. And then we get to the end of the stairs. This one's pretty straightforward. Reel 9. Reel 9 is not a really good reflection because the music changed considerably in the mix stage. So for a while, we actually just didn't have music here at the beginning when we do. And we did end temp and we did when we previewed. But it was important for us to sort of remove it for a little bit in our Avid to just work on it. Reel 9 was all about VFX. And it was really about, I had my cut of it and it didn't change for a very, very, very long time. We got back from Paris, I cut it and we worked on it and then we trimmed it a tiny bit. But then we just had to hand it to VFX and let them do their thing. And so this is very much about just sort of how to make it as beautiful as possible. And that was everything. My favorite choices in the film are at the end here and when he's sitting on the steps. I'm really proud of it. It was my pitch to cut to a flashback of Helen, and then that stayed, and then everyone likes it. Because the other films, I guess 3 doesn't, but 1 and 2 do rely on these flashbacks a lot to Helen. And it's this like, I just wanted to bring it full circle. And it kind of gets me every time when I watch it. This slow-mo version of them kissing, of like, that's the last thing he thinks about before he dies. One other thing, I guess I should have brought this up in Reel 7, but Chad teases me immensely about how many cross dissolves I have in the movie. And there are 4, secretly 5, bonus points to anyone who finds the 5th. I'm a weird defender of cross dissolves. Do I think they belong everywhere? No. I have been sort of made fun of, the whole can't solve it, dissolve it. Of course, that is a thing. But I do believe that it's a lost art of creating a third unique image based off 2 that is more impactful than a juxtaposition. I really do. I think you're saying more about an ocean flying over John as he's dead. You're saying more than if it was a cut. You're saying more when the city of New York turns into gravestones, a city of death. And just selfishly, I think that the map dissolving into the Arc de Triomphe was very much of a Indiana Jones homage, to myself at least. And so it's just sort of, I just think they're fun and people don't use them enough. Not saying they belong everywhere, but I do think that it's one of those things, if I just sort of followed my heart and believe in whatever's best to tell the story, tell the story. Reel 10 only exists because of that weird limit I told you about earlier for 35 millimeter film. And we have to archive it. And our end crawl was too long to fit in Reel 9. So we really do Reel 9, main on ends, and then we just do another reel, and it's the end crawl. And then we have our final scene, the final tag. So yeah, that's it. That's the timeline tour. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the movie and learned a little bit about how I worked and how our amazing team put it together.